Morning all, author Brian S. Pratt here. I'm going to read chapter 13 of Fires of Prophecy, book 2 of the Morcyth Saga. Just to let you guys know that my internet sometimes is good, sometimes is bad. I don't know if it's my internet or my phone, but the uploads, like yesterday for chapter 12, I always do it at the same time. You know, I do the readings about 5 a.m. and by 6 a.m. they're starting to upload. Some days I'll upload it and it'll be 45 minutes. Other days it'll be hours. Or like yesterday, I came back at about 12 noon and it was at 49%. It wasn't moving. It just said on my computer when I went into it, YouTube, it said it was at 49% uploading. On my phone it said waiting. Waiting for what? I don't know. And so I had to stop it and restart it. And so I always upload the same time every day, but for whatever the reason, it just doesn't want to get up there. It's irritating. We got new internet. It seems to be better than the old one. Anyway, chapter 13, and we're finally getting back to Miko. Thank goodness. Can't believe I waited so long to get back to him, but here we are. Chapter 13, and he's currently on his way to Khorasan in the Slain Lives. He's traveling. The snap of the lash across the back woke Michael from another restless, nightmare-filled night. He quickly got to his feet before the lash struck again and looked around at the others in the slave line being kicked or lashed awake. There were a number of empty spots along the lines where those who were unable to keep up were no longer with them. He tried not to think about them, lying dead in shallow graves along the road. He remembered with anguish one old-timer who collapsed in line and was lashed to get moving before they realized he'd already died. They had two captains dig a hole in the ground and to put him in. Thankfully, he had been spared that duty. The first night was the worst. His body ached from the long march and his mind was dizzy from the heat, as well as a lack of food and drink. But that wasn't what had made it so horrible. After they stopped and everyone had been fed and given water, the slaver returned to the girl who had insisted that she wasn't a slave and removed her from the line. She screamed the entire way as they took her to one of the tents. The memory of her screams and pleading as they echoed through the night continued to haunt him. No one got any sleep that night, even after she had finally quieted several hours later. The next morning, when the lash brought him to consciousness, the girl had already been returned to her place in line. One eye was blackened and multiple bruises showed on every part of her body. There was a vacant look in her eyes, and when given food, she wouldn't eat. Given water, she wouldn't drink. Yeah, I have questions about putting this in there because, for the most part, my books are PG-13. This doesn't explicitly say what went on, but everybody knows what went on. And it still kind of bothers me to this day. But slavers are what they are. And I mean, probably if I had written this today, I'd have gotten far more detail because that's just what people do these days, apparently. But no, I don't think I would. No, there's just some things you don't have to explicitly talk about. When the lion was ready to move, she remained on the ground. Two slavers came to her and whipped her until she came back to her senses and stood. Once she was on her feet, crying, with tears streaming down her face, one of the slavers stepped in front of her and said loudly enough so everyone could hear, "Oh, are you a slave?" Hang on a second. Yeah. Not said, but asked. Stepped in front of her and asked loudly enough so everyone could hear, "Are you a slave?" A very audible yes escaped her lips. The lash struck her across the shoulders and he just glared at her. "Yes, master," she cried out loudly. Nodding, the slaver returned to the front of the line by the wagon. Everyone in the slave line was quiet, unable to even look at the ravished, punished girl. Michael shuddered at the memory as he got his bowl of food and cup of water to drink. He hungrily consumed it all, wanting more, but knowing better than to ask. After the bowls and cups were collected, they got moving. He couldn't remember how long he'd been walking. The days were a blur of pain and exhaustion. The only thing keeping him moving was the certainty that James would come. He would not abandon him. It was early in the afternoon when a commotion drew his attention to the front of the line. Looking up, he saw them pointing to a large body of water coming into view ahead. A large city sat on its shore. Khorazan, announced one of the slavers. There you will be placed at auction and sold to your new masters. A hushed silence fell as they marched toward their doom, each dreading the fate awaiting them. I didn't have a period in the sentence. Every last person in line was quiet when they passed through the gates of Khorazan. Michael looked at the people on the streets and noticed that they didn't even look at those in the slave lines. It was almost as if they weren't even people to them. They were taken to a large complex at the edge of town, holding pens for those awaiting the auction block. There, Michael was removed from his line, and the slavers separated the captives by age and sex. He was herded into a holding pen with other boys and young men. Several fights broke out by those being separated from wives and children, but in the end, they went where they were told, often with blood running down their backs from the numerous lashings required to subdue them. Once they had been in their pen for a while, one of the lads, a few years older than Michael, came to him and said in a whisper, "We gotta get out of here." Michael just looked at him and asked, "How?" "Rush the guard or something." "I don't think it would do any good," Michael told him. Obviously not getting any support for his idea, the lad went to another group of boys, where Michael heard them whispering among themselves. "I hope they don't do anything stupid to get me killed," he thought as he glanced to the older boys, huddled with hands together. Now, I'm thinking if Michael hadn't been sure James would come for him, that he may have gone along with the boys to get out of there. Another young man in the pen with him came over and said, "Wonder what's going to happen now?" Shrugging, Michael said, "Don't know. Name's Victor," he said, holding out his hand. Taking the hand, he replied, "Miko." Victor glanced over to the group of boys who were conversing together quietly. "Think they're right?" "What, those guys?" Michael asked, indicating the group planning an escape. When Victor nodded, he said, "I doubt it. The slavers are going to anticipate something like that. They've been doing this a long time." "But what choice do we have?" Victor asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Right now, none." Victor started sobbing. "I want to go home." "So do we all," Michael said, uncomfortable at the show of emotion Victor displayed. Victor returned to his corner and sat down by himself, knees pulled up against his chest, and laid his head in his arms, silently crying. Doing his best to hold back his own emotions, Michael sat and stared out of the pen. An hour passed before several slavers came and brought food and water, as well as a bucket for use as a slop bucket. When they got close to the door of his pen, the boys from the group moved closer to the door, and Michael backed away to the far side, anticipating trouble. Two of the slavers had crossbows, wound and armed, and casually aimed at the boys, while another said, "Back up." When the boys didn't move, he signaled the crossbowmen to take direct aim on them, and then he said again, "Back up." With two crossbows staring them down, the boys backed up several feet, allowing him to open the door and place a platter of bread and old meat on the floor. Stepping back, he closed the door and then proceeded down to the next pen. When the door shut, Michael dove for the food and grabbed two big handfuls of meat and bread before the other boys had a chance to take it. The meat was a little ripe, but the bread tasted only slightly stale. He'd eaten far worse when on the streets of Baron. He wolfed it down quickly before someone got it into his head to take it away from him. Another habit learned on the streets. So Michael, being a street kid, he's got habits that the others don't, probably, which are going to help him survive slavery until James finds him. Two boys were left with nothing to eat. One was Victor. He just sat and stared at the empty plate as if not believing that there was nothing for him. Michael saw him start to say something to one of the slavers, but then remembered the girl that had complained on the road and shut his mouth. Rolling onto his side, he got into a fetal position and started sobbing all over again. The other boys looked at him with disdain, and one said, "You better be faster next time." The others just laughed. Michael felt bad for the boy, but was unwilling to share his meager food with him. Even though he got as much as his hands could grab, it still wasn't enough to quiet the grumbling of his belly. Michael went to a small window that overlooked an inner courtyard. Looking out, he saw a large platform on the far side that would be used for auctions, though it stood empty now. How about though it currently stood empty. Smelling something foul, he turned around and saw one of the boys using the slot bucket, and he thought it could get pretty ripe in there after a while. Leaving the window, he found a spot as far from the bucket as possible and settled down to rest. The light outside began to fade as night fell. During the night, he heard many boys crying and sobbing. Some cried for their mothers. He eventually broke down too, as silent tears rolled down his cheek. One boy in a nearby pen completely lost it and started screaming and trying to break through the bars. The door at the end of the pens opened, and 2 slavers came in with torches and long sticks. They moved to where the boy screamed uncontrollably and opened the door. As soon as the door opened, the boy tried to leave, and that's when they beat him with sticks until he quieted down. Either he stopped on his own accord, or they beat him into unconsciousness. Miko couldn't tell, but he was glad when the screaming ended. Once the guards left and it was back again dark and quiet, he heard whispers coming from others in his pen. There were only 2 of them. No crossbows. Might be our only chance. Some of the boys moved toward the door and then laid down near it. All of a sudden, one of them began acting just like the other boy had, screaming and banging out on the door, trying to get out. Just as before, the 2 guards entered the pen area and crossed over to the commotion and opened the door. When the door opened, the slavers rushed in and began beating the one who was making the fuss. With the landing of the first blow, boys who had stationed themselves near the door sprang up and attacked. In short order, the slavers lay on the ground unconscious at the boys' feet. The boys, now with the torches and sticks, and filled with hope of escape, raced out of the pen. Miko stayed where he was and watched as they ran down the hallway toward the open door through which the slavers had entered. Suddenly, he saw one fall backward as a crossbow bolt struck him in the chest. Another boy twisted and fell with a cry when a second bolt struck him. The hallway filled with slavers, and the ill-fated escape attempt was quickly squashed. The boys caught outside of the pen were taken away, and a couple slavers came back to where Miko and a few of the others had remained. They removed the unconscious slavers the boys had attacked and then left. One slaver paused a moment as he looked at those remaining in the pen, then said something before closing the door. He turned to follow his fellow slavers across the room and out the door, closing it behind him. When the door closed, the pens were once more plunged into darkness. Michael heard Victor giggling over in the corner. He tried to shut it out and fall asleep. Early the next morning, shortly after sunup, they heard a commotion coming from the courtyard outside. Michael rushed to the window, as did others in the pens along the same wall. Outside, they saw the boys who had been captured in the escape attempt the night before being marched to a pole standing near one of the courtyard. A hushed whisper could be heard as some of those in the adjoining pens relayed what was going on to those on the other side of the holding area. When the boys reached the pole, one slaver addressed the slaves looking from the windows in the holding pens. "Last night, a few of you decided to try and escape," he said loudly so all could hear. "These 8 are those that survived. Should any be contemplating similar attempts, let this be a lesson in what happens to those slaves who try to escape their fate." He said something to the other slavers, and the first boy was taken to the pole where his arms were tied to ropes. A slaver behind the pole pulled the ropes, raising the boy's arms high above his head, stretching him until only the tips of his toes touched the ground. Then a man with a multi-tongued whip came forward and began to lash him. As the lash struck the first time, a hushed silence fell upon those in the pen. The boy cried out as the lash struck him a second time. Each time the lash struck, it left long red welts, which after the first couple of stripes began welling blood. After 10 lashes, the boy was screaming incoherently, and blood flowed freely down his back. At 12, he lost consciousness, and they removed him from the whipping pole, taking him away. Once the pole was clear, they brought up the next boy, who by now gibbered with fear. "I won't try to escape! I won't!" he screamed, pleading with the slavers. As they strung him up, he continued to cry and plead, all to no avail. When the first blow landed, his bowels let go and he soiled himself. Boy after boy took their turn at the whipping post until they'd either been given 15 lashes or they slipped into unconsciousness. As the last boy was taken away, the man in charge looked around at the faces peering in horror from the windows, then turned without a word and walked back into the building. The ground at the base of the pole was red with the blood that the whip had drawn from the boy's back. Not long after that, they brought in food and water. This time, when the plate was placed within the pen, there was enough for everyone. The screams of the boys as they were whipped echoed through Miko's mind. A couple hours later, the courtyard filled up with all sorts of people, and a string of girls were brought out onto the platform. One by one, the girls were brought to the front, had their slave attire stripped from them, and then the bidding commenced. Miko watched through the window as girl after girl was auctioned off, knowing that soon it would be his turn. He turned his attention back inside when he heard a commotion brewing at the entrance to the slave pens. A man of obvious importance entered with a slaver that Miko had seen in the pens before. Obviously distraught. The slaver appeared to be pleading with the other man, but whatever he said was having little effect. Several guards followed them, and as the man walked through, he pointed to pens, and the guards removed the boys within and strung them in a line. When he reached Miko's pen, he pointed to it, and soon Miko and the others were tied to the end of the line. The guards came to Victor, who lay on the floor, gibbering to himself. They looked back over to the man, and one said something. The man glanced at Victor and then shook his head. His men left him there as they moved on to the next pen. After half the pens had been emptied, the officious-looking man said something to the slaver, who appeared to be about ready to argue with him. With a stern look, the man stopped any complaints the slaver might have had about taking the slaves. With resignation, the slaver followed him back outside. The selected boys followed along behind. They were marched through several adjoining pens until they came to the outside where wagons waited. The guards untied the boys from the line and then directed them to climb onto the wagons. The official gave a letter to another man, who then climbed onto the lead wagon, and then they began to roll out. Michael wasn't sure what just happened, but at the moment was simply happy to be out of there. They rolled through town and were soon exiting through the southern gate. Unbeknownst to Michael, on the far side of town, James entered Corazon from the north. And that ends 13. So, James is at Corazon. Michael is no longer in Corazon. Where Tersa is, we're not sure. But she's probably the slave pens, right? Waiting auction. So the next one is James in Corazon. They arrive, and we'll see what happens. Yeah, slavery is a terrible thing. I've got no love for it, and I was trying to make it where everyone hated slavers, and I think I did a good job on that. And you really feel for Miko and the other slavers with you. Well, that's chapter 13. Oh, my girlfriend made it to personal stuff. My girlfriend made it to Omaha, and she actually climbed up the 10 steps on her own without any help. She said it should have took everything out of her, but she made it. So she's healing, she's progressing, she's doing more than she could before. You know, sometimes she has felt that I'm gonna be like this forever, but it takes months to get over a 360 infusion. You know, 4 big incisions, 3 in the back, 1 in the hip. Had to move a muscle. Oh man, she was in a lot of pain for a long time, but now she's getting better. She's with her sister and family, and they're going to help her out. She'll be back home on the 5th, and I will drive down to see her and stay with her for the weekend on the 6th. So when she gets back and she's really exhausted, I'll be there to help her out. But that doesn't mean we're going to rest. No. We got to keep her going. So, because if she starts to take it easy, it'll just take her that much longer to actually get healed and recuperated. So I'll do chapter 14 tomorrow. Get this uploaded. Hopefully it does it well. Miko chapters seem to be shorter chapters. We're not quite halfway through the book yet. We still got I think chapter 15 is halfway. So yeah, that's it. I'll see you tomorrow.